So moving on with what I was just talking about, if this was basically the plan, this notion of territorial expansion, conquest, and extermination, if it seems to have a corollary with the United States, this may well indeed have been the model that the Third Reich had in mind, precisely this idea of manifest destiny from the 19th century. Say there, in one respect, the goals of the Third Reich could be compared to American manifest destiny, the ideal of a particular group of people, a nation or an ethnic group, ordained just to take over this land, even though it's already occupied by other people, in this case, the Aboriginal people, the America, to conquer that land and to turn it into a model replica of themselves. And indeed, as I say, Hitler had this idea of looking to America as this land of prosperity due to its vast land territory, access to all of these resources, foodstuffs, everything you could ask for, and also this kind of vision of the automotive industry, a vision of a vast country, vast land full of different highways and cars. Because Hitler, as someone who was famously not interested in domestic issues, did have actually one domestic ideal that he did focus on, and that was the car industry. He was really fixated on the idea of developing the automobile, that being a model for individual freedom and transportation in the future. You should have a lot of land with a lot of highways. When it came to other domestic issues, I mean, people could say, well, we talk about the war industry. What kind of domestic leader was Adolf Hitler? The answer is an indifferent one. He barely seemed to care about most domestic issues. His focus was on the war machine that he was attempting to assemble. So from this perspective, the Nazi-instigated war in Europe amounted to an attempt to industrialize and accelerate a process that had happened in America during the 1800s. Now, there is, of course, a crucial difference, which is precisely that idea of industrializing and accelerating the process, because it's true that the American people, this ethnic group, had expanded across this territory. But as I mentioned, during the course of the 1800s, this was a chaotic and haphazard process. It never really had that one driving force behind it. Different points, the government was eager to gobble up more territory, to buy vast tracts of land, as they did with the Louisiana Purchase. But also remember what I said, that in many other instances, the American government was trying to put the halt on expansion. They didn't want more and more people pouring into the frontier because they were going to lose control of those people. You had also the different threads that occurred here. Mentioned the Mormons, for instance, one religious group that participates in this idea of manifest destiny with their trek into what became Utah. Also remember the gold rush to California. There you have another thread in the process where a bunch of people pour into California because they've heard that there's gold there. You have individual pioneers and settlers. You also have the government laying railroad tracks as well. So it's all this kind of disjointed hodgepodge, and that has been the history of this kind of territorial expansion and conquest. Because make no mistake, this kind of thing has been going on throughout human history. Sometimes there's something in the way of integration, but there is also processes of different groups of people invading a land and simply, quote, replacing the people that already live there. I mean, that's what the Anglo-Saxons did with Britain way back in the day. They replaced or expelled, killed off, or drove to the margins the Celtic people who already lived on the island. The key point is traditionally this has been not really an organized process. It's just been a kind of gradual invasion. Well, think about the 20th century context, the development of industrialization to the level where a government and a military intends to impose exactly that process, tries to take control of the process of territorial expansion and conquest. That's what the Third Reich was attempting to do. Now saying, well, we can organize and coordinate in a top-down way exactly this notion of wiping out a population of people and replacing them with ourselves. Why would they attempt to do that? Well, a view sculpted by the First World War. I mean, that was Hitler's perspective, was basically a product of First World War thinking, carnage, bloodshed, destruction, the relentless struggle against enemies, against other nations. Kill them or they will kill you. That's the kind of mentality that was fostered during the First World War, and it hung over the entire continent. Get into the war in Europe, but also the war in the Pacific as well, because America would participate in the war in Europe with the D-Day landings, the invasion of Normandy to retake Western Europe. But there was another side to it, which was the war in the Pacific against the Empire of Japan. There you see a world map in the summer of 1941, so prior to the United States' entry into the war, giving a sense of the scope of this global war. And we can often forget these details because we focus on particular theaters of the war, as they call it, in the Pacific or Europe. Well, look at how much of the world's population is involved in the war at this juncture, and America is not even in it yet. You have the light blue sections, which represent the Allies at this point, which include not just Britain, but the British Empire, which is all of these different nations, which are still part of the empire, thus at war with the Axis. And you have the black sections, which represent the Axis. Germany had, by this point, instigated its conquest and occupation of Europe. Most of Europe, with a couple of exceptions. Switzerland was neutral, Sweden was neutral, but a lot of these other countries were simply under German military occupation. Italy was allied with Germany, so not under occupation, but nonetheless in an alliance with them. But you also have in the east another segment of the Axis powers that would be Imperial Japan, which had been waging a war in China for some time, and also in Korea as well. And Japan and Germany were in an alliance as well. Red section represents the Soviet Union. This was, in effect, an image of the world splitting into these giant alliances. It's like continents pitted against each other. That's the kind of model that we end up with, as depicted in George Orwell's famous dystopian novel, 1984. The model he has in that novel is of these three kind of continental alliances. They're all perpetually, eternally at war with each other. Well, it makes sense when you look at the world map and how it was shaping up at this point. You see depiction of German aircraft over the Soviet Union. The USSR is marked in red at this point because they weren't actually in the war, but then there was the German invasion of the Soviet Union that follows in June of 1941. I say there, notwithstanding a creaky alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the German military did invade this country. They had formed a peace agreement, which was basically based on mutual non-aggression, but the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were ideologically opposed to one another. One's a communist regime, another's a fascist regime. All they really have in common is their extremism and their total disregard for human rights. But in terms of their principles and values, they're completely opposed to one another. In terms of Germany invading the USSR, well, this was partly because Germany had grown dependent in the war on Soviet raw materials such as oil, food, and alloy metals. So Germany needed the resources of the Soviet Union to continue fighting the war and also to fulfill their vision of what they were going to do in Eastern Europe. In fact, the ridiculous thing at this point was the trade networks that existed between Germany and the Soviet Union. It's one of the bizarre points of history that right up until the invasion in June of 1941, Germany was sending industrial machinery to the Soviet Union as trade, as exchange. The industrial machinery was fueling the Soviet military apparatus. So in a strange way, they're actually providing resources to the Soviet military, the military that they were about to go to war against. So this gives you a sense of the way these network alliance systems can persist right up until the moment countries go to war. You might have this sense of, well, why would Germany invade a country that is giving them abundant oil, food, and alloy metals? Well, it's partly because they're giving them these things. They can see what they have, right? Someone paying you vast amounts of money. Oh, I see how much you have. I'm just going to come and take it. But this takes us also back to the question of America, but also because it wanted to create an opening for a Japanese attack against America. Nazi Germany at this point was desperate to avoid a confrontation with America. Go back to the map at this time. British Empire is at war, but the United States is not. What's developing here is a kind of Anglo-American alliance. Once America enters the war, well, then you have the full wrath of all these different countries turned against the Third Reich. Situation is going to be a lot better if Japan is also involved in the war against the United States. The problem is that Japan is very close to the Soviet Union, so Germany was effectively trying to knock the Soviet Union out of the war, to basically unleash Imperial Japan, give the Japanese an opening for their war against the United States. Well, to an extent, this is what happened. The only real big snag in Hitler's plans is that the German conquest of the Soviet Union did not go as planned, and in fact did not end up happening at all. But nonetheless, the Japanese did enter the war against America with their notorious surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the day that will live in infamy, on December 7th, 1941. And I say there at the bottom, this stage of the war could be described as a battle over the last and largest major waterway, the Pacific Ocean. In a sense, there, Imperial Japan was not entering the war just for the sake of supporting Nazi Germany. That was just an alliance founded on convenience. No, Japan was in fact trying to construct their own empire over this area, including parts of China, the Philippines, various other areas in Oceania. And there you can see the expansion of the goals of Imperial Japan at this time. And it was this increasingly aggressive militaristic policy on the part of Japan, which was bringing them into conflict with the United States, because you had America with its military base in Hawaii, for instance, at Pearl Harbor. I think part of what is interesting about this is precisely this idea of the Pacific Ocean as a great waterway. Remember what I said before about the role that the sea or waterways have played in the formation of empires. You look across history and you see these empires draped across these major thoroughfares of water, such as the old Roman Empire draped over the Mediterranean Sea. The Vikings actually had their kind of empire, which petered out, but nonetheless traced its way across the upper part of the Atlantic, passing through the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and even reaching the New World. And then when you get into the days of Columbus, the Atlantic Ocean becomes this thoroughfare for empire, for the expansion of the European empires across an entire ocean. It becomes this conduit for trade and exchange, also military conquest, slavery, and eventually just the importation of people in huge numbers. So one of the kind of last bastions here was the enormous, biggest Pacific Ocean. Think of that as a kind of a waterway or a gateway for imperialist conquest. The United States had found itself in part on this ideal of indeed westward expansion, conquering the West, manifest destiny. Only problem is once you get to the coast, there's no more land left to conquer. America kind of sort of runs out of space with which it can fulfill its ideal. So what would be the answer? Well, you keep going across the ocean. I mean, the ocean is a lot of water to cover, right? But they did that with Hawaii, annexation of Hawaii in the latter part of the 1800s. So there's this idea that the American kind of ethos can expand even further, but eventually comes up against Japan, which is thinking in the same way, expanding eastward into the Pacific. So the war ends up actually being a battle over this last great tract of a seaway for imperialist conquest, and the Pacific War basically unfolds as a battle that is waged in a very brutal fashion across these various islands you see here. Get into the topic of the atomic bomb. The war in Europe ended in April 1945. The Pacific War continued, dragged on all the way till basically close to the end of the summer, August of 1945. But the story here was that America was certainly winning the war against the Japanese by the time we get into the summer of 1945, simply for the reasons I mentioned previously. America with the highest standard of living, yes, but also the most resources, the most money, the biggest military. I mean, the Japanese could hold out as best they could against the United States, but it was in part inevitable that America was eventually going to win the war. And well, they did it. Not through direct conquest of Japan, but by dropping atomic bombs onto Japan twice, once in Hiroshima and once in Nagasaki. You see a model of the atomic bomb that the United States used on Hiroshima, Japan in August of 1945. This weapon was the culmination of the secretive and costly Manhattan Project, which began in 1941. So when America entered into the war, the Manhattan Project, I think it cost something like $2 billion, which is an enormous sum of money at the time, and rediverted a lot of the resources from the war effort into this kind of a game-changing weapon. Debates about the ethics of the atomic bomb have occurred since then. There's been a lot of literature and criticism about the ethics, the morality of dropping a nuclear weapon onto a city in any country, because the thing with an atomic bomb is it's indiscriminate. It just wipes out, kills off whatever is below. And that was certainly the case with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, notwithstanding the idea of these being military targets, which the American government claimed they were. Civilians, many civilians were going to die and did die in the atomic bombings. And of course, there's the after effects of radiation poisoning as well. There wasn't really a lot of debate at the time about using the atomic bomb, though. No, they just used it. In fact, the entire project, the entire Manhattan Project, was predicated on the idea that, of course, we're going to use the atomic bomb once it's developed. What's the point of spending all this money and investing all this in the project if we're not going to use it? That was basically the mentality, and there wasn't really much in the way of dialogue or debate because the whole project was secretive. It was kept under wraps. So this is a kind of a typical wartime mentality, which has been repeated and existed previously, is use the weapon first and then debate about it afterwards. I mean, whether that's an ethical thing to do is another question, but that has been the tendency to simply introduce the weapon, and then we can have the conversation after the fact. Another point was that the atomic bomb was not something that existed in isolation. It was an extension of the already existing Allied bombing campaign because the Allies, British and the Americans, had invested a lot in developing a massive bombing campaign, and they had been bombing city centers, civilian areas already through conventional firebombing tactics, such as Tokyo, been firebombed. Tens of thousands of civilians had died there. And in Europe, there was the Allied bombing of Dresden as well toward the end of the war. So the atomic bomb was not this kind of isolated thing, but it existed within the larger bombing campaign that the Allies were conducting at this point. Well, the atomic bomb did basically end the war, using the weapon twice. Japanese surrendered shortly thereafter. The introduction of nuclear weapons seemed to mark the culmination in the escalation of industrial warfare, something that had been going on at least since World War I, if not the era of the Civil War in the United States, a point that I brought up previously. The application of modern industrial technology to warfare, and the idea that you can build weapons like giant dreadnought ships or tanks or the machine gun, which become these industrial machines of destruction that make the process of killing people much more efficient than it had been previously. As I said, the European powers completely neglected to realize the ramifications of that before they stumbled into the First World War, where industrial weaponry was released on a huge scale. And there had just been this escalation in that up to the Second World War. By the time we get to the Second World War, you have aircraft, for instance, playing a central role. As I said before, yes, there were airplanes in the First World War, not really a big factor, huge factor in the Second World War. Jet airplanes were first starting to be introduced towards the end of the Second World War, rockets, missiles, all of that stuff. So just escalation more and more and more, and then kind of plateaus with the atomic bomb. Suddenly they find the one weapon which is the true game changer, which is capable of destroying an entire city. in the blink of an eye, wiping out hundreds of thousands or millions of people all at once. And it's almost as though that's kind of the limit in terms of weaponry that we can develop. Yes, they've developed variations of nuclear weapons since then, but there isn't really much of a reason to develop a weapon beyond the atomic bomb. So what are the consequences of this? Well, a much debated, quote, nuclear peace may now exist. May now exist or may not exist. It's actually really difficult to say because hard as it is to believe, we're not that far removed from 1945. It's still less than 100 years ago. So it's a mistake to kind of build a theory that works on the assumption that this nuclear peace truly does exist because we don't know. Not enough time has passed. The basic idea of a nuclear peace says that the threat of nuclear weapons is enough to deter countries from going to war with one another because they'll just destroy each other if they try to fight a war against one another. Part of that was applied to the Cold War conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. The period of extended tension between the USSR and the USA, which lasted for decades, they never fought a war directly against each other. They had a bunch of kind of proxy conflicts, and there was certainly the threat of one with the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, but never an outright war. Well, they just destroy each other if they fought a war, because they have enough nuclear weapons to wipe out every single city in each country. There are enough nuclear weapons in the world today to destroy every single place of over 100,000 people. So every single thing that can qualify as a city, including Reykjavik, for instance, could be destroyed by nuclear weapons today. So it kind of ushers in that question of saying, well, the destructive capacity is such that it makes fighting a war on that scale just moot, essentially. A quote that sometimes is attributed to Albert Einstein, it's not clear if he actually did say this, it's a kind of anecdotal thing, but it sounds like something he could have said. I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. In other words, World War III will basically destroy human civilization as it exists, and then our successors subsequently will be back to the era of throwing rocks and sticks at one another, because no technology will exist. Nothing in the way of civilization will exist. Is the nuclear peace really real? Well, as I say, tough to say. We can't really tell. One thing that is clear, though, is that other countries have certainly become attuned to the idea of acquiring a nuclear weapon for their own defense. And this is just a piece of technology that any country can acquire, can obtain, if it invests enough in it. There was a very brief period in which America might take the stance of, well, we're the good guys, we're the strongest, richest country in the world, thus we have the atomic bomb. That kind of backwards logic of saying, well, it's because of American society that we possess the biggest and baddest weapon around. But that didn't last. I mean, the Soviet Union was testing a nuclear weapon by, I think, 1949. So, I mean, within less than 5 years, the Soviet Union has its own nuclear weapon as well. And that changes the constellation, the landscape. Well, look at the countries that have attempted to acquire nuclear weapons or have had nuclear weapon programs. Pakistan, North Korea, right? The famous rogue state, the rogue regime, has a developed nuclear weapons program because they recognize it as a weapon that will protect the regime, even if they would not survive a war otherwise against the United States, or even South Korea, for that matter. Not only that, but the North Korean regime uses its nuclear weapons as a bargaining chip to basically push its own agenda. So this is a real thing, this kind of idea of the atomic bomb as being, again, just a piece of technology that any country, any state can acquire. So it's difficult to say whether it really is going to preserve peace in the long run. And so the last topic today, the beginning of the Cold War. At the end of the war in 1945, and you don't have necessarily a kind of soft fade into peace, but rather you have a transition to a new period of tension between the United States and another country, in this case the Soviet Union. They're the topics to look at for stages of the Cold War, defining it, and the American terror of communism. There was a seemingly cordial 1945 meeting between British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who'd replaced Winston Churchill, U.S. President Harry Truman, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had died, and the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who gathered to determine the fate of post-war Europe. By this point, the war was not over in Europe, but nonetheless, the Allies were clearly going to win it. But in truth, cracks were already appearing in the relationship between the U.S. and the USSR. This was almost a continuation of something that had existed previously, an American suspicion of the old Russian Empire, precisely because it was an autocratic regime under the Tsar, so a kind of single power state, not a democracy, not a kind of liberal country. Well, the Soviet Union, the peculiar successor to the Russian Empire, was very much a totalitarian, authoritarian state with a dictatorial leader, Joseph Stalin. And so there was always this kind of sense of an uneasy alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union. They were allies towards the end of the Second World War against a common enemy, namely Germany and Japan as well. But this did not seem like the kind of alliance that was going to last for very long. You see the development of the Eastern and Western blocs in Europe. The beginning of the Cold War seemed to represent a showdown between Woodrow Wilson's and Vladimir Lenin's competing visions for the future of Europe. I bring that up because Wilson and Lenin had both died roughly around the same time, 1924, and they both had these ideas of what Europe was going to look like. Remember Woodrow Wilson with his 14 points, kind of broaching the idea of the United Nations, or what would become the United Nations, the idea of open, transparent exchanges between different countries, integration of the various countries so that they are codependent, but also, of course, the kind of American ideal of countries as republics, so not with monarchies, countries with democratic elections, with certain freedoms of the press, of freedoms of speech and religion, etc. That was Wilson's kind of idealistic notion of what Europe should look like. Did not happen during the post-war period, but that seemed to be the ideal of the Western Allies, and this is what they were attempting to establish, or at least promote, in the various liberated countries, including France, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, and part of Germany, not all of Germany. And on the other hand, you had Vladimir Lenin's kind of ideal of the future of Europe, which was going to be based on this notion of a class struggle, Marxist ideology, the proletarian revolution, and essentially communist regimes, which is exactly what the Soviet Union had established as it began winning the war with Germany. There you see the various Soviet republics, which are contained within the USSR, but also these kinds of satellite states in places like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia as well. But at the same time, you look at Wilson and you look at Lenin, they might have had this idea that this is going to be a grassroots movement, that essentially is going to be the people living in Europe who are going to rise up and demand this kind of government, or alternatively, that kind of government, because this is what the basis for this idea of a proletarian revolution will be based on, the notion of this is what the working class of the world really wants. They want to throw off the bourgeois hegemony and imperialism and nationalism. They want to kind of embrace this pluralism of people. So too, Wilson and America could say the same thing. People want democracy. They want freedom. They want a capitalist system for prosperity. All of those things. But really what happened in the immediate post-war period, so after 1945, was an enormous power vacuum in Europe, and America and the USSR both rolling in. So it wasn't really the question of what the people precisely wanted. It was these two superpower states overseeing the reconstruction of Europe, but overseeing it in completely contrary ways, because they have different ideas of what Europe is supposed to look like. The power vacuum, absolutely pervasive. I mean, Germany had completely disintegrated and collapsed at the end of the war. France was under Nazi occupation throughout most of the war. Italy had been a fascist regime under Mussolini and participated in a disastrous way in the war. And how many other countries under military occupation at the time? So as soon as all of that disintegrates, there's this vacuum, there's this need to reconstruct, and you have these two superpower states that just kind of flood into the continent. This became the story of a polarizing world. It was almost as though this image of the world breaking apart into these big camps, these big alliance systems, it's almost like it continued even after the Second World War was over. But it was no longer these imperialist fascist regimes such as existed in Germany, Italy, or Japan. No, instead you had the liberal democracies versus the communist states. And you get a sense, again, of the kind of global totality of the geopolitical order that emerged at this time. You have America and its allies, marked in blue and purple, so countries that are directly allied with America through NATO, which is a military alliance, which still exists. You have other countries that are kind of allies with America or receiving aid from the United States. Red strip there is Cuba. So Cuba with its communist regime, not an ally of America. And the green states, you have countries that are still European colonies at this point in Africa, but there's movements for independence already developing at this time. And then on the other hand, you have the red marking the communist regimes, which include, of course, the Soviet Union, parts of Eastern Europe, but also China, which did not stay an ally of the USSR for long, but nonetheless was a communist regime that emerged in the late 1940s and early 1950s. It was typically the assumption that this was just a kind of a binary competition. The polarizing binary logic that America as a whole seems to be in love with was applied to this version of the world, and thus this kind of assumption that any country, any nation that shows signs of becoming a communist state or embracing communist ideology must just be a puppet of the Soviet Union. This was their perception of China originally. I mean, China, the vast, enormous country with its many millions of people. The idea that China is basically just a subordinate, a lackey to the Soviet Union. Well, no, China had its own version of communism. Still has today its own version of communism. It's its own country. And so too the case with all of the various other countries. America, with its pointless and disastrous war in Vietnam later on, based on the assumption that Vietnam is just going to be a subordinate puppet state of the ruling communist ideology. Well, the Vietnamese were fighting the war for their own reason, because they were developing their own independence regime, their own nationalist regime as well. So it wasn't just the case that Vietnam is this satellite state. No, it's a country unto itself. So too with Korea, so too with Afghanistan, where the Soviets were involved, so too with all these other nations. So it was never just this 50-50 even split, but rather a kind of plurality of different countries loosely allied with these two sides. So let's define this then. Period of tension, polarization, period in which America and the Soviets as well see the world as split into these two camps. Cold War itself, a period of tension, conflict, and proxy battles between two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, which is generally dated between 45 and 91. 91 is when the Soviet Union disintegrated. The tensions fluctuated during this time period. Sometimes they reached a boil, such as during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost introduced a nuclear war to modern society. Sometimes there was a period of what they called détente, which was basically a kind of easing of the relations between the two countries. So it wavered over this period, but there was always this sense of the Americans and Soviets being opposed to each other. And this was a tension, a conflict that broke out in all sorts of different ways. I mean, there are numerous ways in which they could compete against each other. The benign sense at the Olympics, for instance, in a kind of other sense with the famous space race. The Soviets were the first to launch satellites up into space. Thus, the Americans had to land on the moon, right? They had to try and outdo the Soviets in some way. So it became this competition that was waged over space, over the cosmos. They even fought a kind of battle over the supersonic jet. That was actually Britain and France which introduced the Concorde, the supersonic jet. Thus, the Soviets had to have their own version of the supersonic jet. And various proxy battles as well, whether we're talking about Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, never America versus the Soviet Union directly, but fighting through other countries, basically. So countries that were allied with one camp or the other. How do we understand the Soviet Union? Well, you have a standard mainstream American political explanation. The Cold War was about democracy versus totalitarianism. And that, of course, would be the kind of staunch American patriotic explanation. You look at America and you see a land of freedom, equality, individual rights, all these different good things, positive values. And this is in contrast to the morally bankrupt USSR, which is this authoritarian regime which promotes censorship, is tyrannical, does not allow people to vote in elections, throws people in gulags, in prison for being political dissidents. Very kind of binary us versus them approach. And you also have a standard counter explanation that the Cold War was really about different economic systems, which is a little bit more, I think, of an interesting explanation for the situation. Not just democracy versus totalitarianism, but capitalism versus communism. A kind of struggle over the future of a material paradigm. Material paradigms, those all-encompassing systems which deal with things like the distribution of resources, with labor, with wealth. Well, here we have a kind of a period of tension between two different versions. You have capitalism, which promotes private property, big corporations and banks, profit-driven enterprises, versus communism, state-controlled businesses, top-down economic planning, minimal private property, etc. And maybe this was really the kind of underlying focus of the Cold War, this struggle over different ways of just chopping up resources, distributing wealth, determining who is rich, who has power, and who is poor. Well, there's a lot of different ways to think about this, and we can just kind of make a brief start on this idea. In terms of a competition between the USA and the USSR, well, what was really the dynamic of this competition, this struggle? Well, one thing that seems clear is that America held an advantage on all levels, though to be fair, it also had a substantial head start. So in terms of affluence, standard of living, prosperity, yes, America was a much richer country than the Soviet Union. Always was, all the way through the Cold War. I mean, if you go to the immediate post-war period, America still had the highest standard of living in the world, whereas about 100 million people in the Soviet Union were suffering from malnutrition at this time. Also, speaking in an objective sense as well, you'd have to say that America was a freer country. I mean, not completely free, of course, because you only have to look at the persistence of the Jim Crow laws, which we're going to talk about next time, or women's rights in the United States, or even working individuals' rights, to understand that America is not this kind of country where everyone is granted equality and freedom just by default of being born in the United States. I mean, there are all sorts of limitations, inhibitions to the freedom of the individual in America. But again, just comparing for the sake of comparison, yes, America was freer than the Soviet Union. The USSR was in every respect a totalitarian regime where individuals could be thrown in prison for being political dissidents or even for speaking out against the Soviet regime. I mean, political dissidents could also earn you time in prison in America, but it was much more draconian and harsher in the USSR. As I say there, to be fair, the United States had a substantial head start on the Soviets because America was already a modern industrial country. That's a very important point to keep in mind when we compare America versus the Soviet Union and talk about the success of capitalism or the success of communism. Well, Russia was not an industrial society even when the revolution first occurred. It was an agrarian agricultural society. So they lagged behind the United States in terms of industrial and infrastructural development by at least 100 years. What the Soviets had done in the 1930s is this high-speed, accelerated process of industrialization where they basically imposed this industrial infrastructural project onto their country in a very short period of time, and it was done in a very kind of chaotic and haphazard manner. So they were still lagging behind inevitably when we get to 1945. Okay, so we're out of time. So leave it there. Come back and talk about the rest of this. So, of course, this is the cutoff point for the test. So study the material for the test, which will take on Monday, and we'll come back next week.